Welcome back to Intersection. This is a program of KBIA and the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Ryan Famuliner, and today we're discussing the challenges in sexual assault cases for the survivors and the justice system. Joining us in studio are Zach Wilson with the Missouri Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, and Mary Beck, the director of the MU Domestic Violence Clinic and a clinical professor of law. And joining us by Skype is Samantha Sunny. She's a former reporter at the Columbia Missourian, and she recently published a story about how the university and local law enforcement handle sexual assault cases, specifically among the college student population. And for those of you in our audience, do you know someone who's been affected by sexual assault or domestic violence? What services or support systems did they need during that time? Share your thoughts. Give us a call at 573-882-8925 or email intersection@kbia.org. You can also tweet us at IntersectKBIA or join our online chat. This is a live show, so as always, we're not exactly sure what will be said, but considering the specific topic of this week's show, we recommend you decide whether or not the content's appropriate for you, especially if you have children with you. And there in the break, I may just have you guys rekindle that conversation you were having about Zach and Mary, about getting to these children, frankly, at the middle school, high school age. What are some of the methods used in the state and in other places, I guess, that seem to have some success at this point?
Well, I mean, there's always age-appropriate conversations you can have with your kids. I mean, that prevention message was loud in the 80s and 90s when it came to sexually transmitted diseases. Mm-hmm. I mean, and so people have started, okay, let's have questions about healthy sexuality earlier. But we can also look on the other side of it as well, too. But then it's also looking at the continuum of what sexual assault really is, from harassment, from making those jokes, those demeaning statements, to making someone less than you. And you can have those conversations at middle school. You can have those conversations in elementary school. So we're seeing some great stuff around the nation at the college level. There's a great model out there, the Green Dot model, and it's really about how bystanders can intervene and help redirect things that are going on. Mizzou, I'm pretty positive, has that program going on. So what we did is we worked with those national curriculum experts and adapted that curriculum and put it at the middle school level. And so now we're really excited about our middle school community mobilization program that's being piloted out in middle schools that we want to be able to take out across the state to start having these conversations earlier, because schools are requiring anti-bullying prevention. That message can go in there. So we've got a great partnership with the Department of Health and Senior Services with their contract to help push those efforts forward. But in order for those programs to move forward inside of a community, those local member programs also need those member programs need the community support. So it's really about how then those communities can come together.
Okay. Well, one thing we've talked a lot about throughout the show, but maybe it might be good to focus on a little bit more, is the idea of victim blaming and what some of the root causes are of that. We've touched on a few things, but at its most basic level, why is that something that happens? I mean, it seems so counterintuitive, right? You've talked, Mary, a little bit earlier about how sometimes it may be a group mentality, right? Especially around, we see a lot in these high-profile cases around sports athletes and things like that, where they have this support system already built up around them. But I don't. What are some of the other root causes of this, I guess?
Well, sexual assault is part of domestic assault, and we have for many years been blaming the victim for interpersonal violence. Like, why didn't she just leave? Like, she's supposed to leave her home instead of putting the blame on the person who assaults and putting the responsibility on the community to respond appropriately to the perpetrator. But instead, we have for generations been blaming the victim. I think it's an extension of that with sexual assault, and probably more intense because sex and women were supposed to not go together until later when they got married, but sex and men was acceptable anytime. And so those stereotypes are really hard to die off.
And Samantha, I know this came up briefly in your reporting as well. What did you find here locally?
Well, there are a lot of different reasons. One thing that I think Zach already mentioned was that mothers don't want to see their sons as rapists. And I mean, nobody wants to see anybody as a rapist. And given that victims in almost all cases know the perpetrator, their friends, their family members, or at least acquaintances, I think rape is such a harsh word, or sexual assault is such a harsh and legal term, that They don't want to apply it to themselves or to their perpetrator. I think on a college campus, alcohol is certainly a big factor, like Mary mentioned. I read one report by an association of prosecutors that said that in cases that involve alcohol, the victim was far less likely to even identify the incident as rape. And then that also gets combined with people who, blame her for being drunk in the first place, for not just getting up and leaving. There are also very few other witnesses often, and it'll just come down to what the victim says versus what the alleged perpetrator says. And unfortunately, often people are inclined to believe the alleged perpetrator over the alleged victim.
Right. And when we went into the break, Mary, you were talking about some of the things you teach your children about being safe in these situations. But what's the balance between teaching these safe behaviors and avoiding that culture of victim blaming? I mean, specifically with drinking, right? I mean, it is a smart thing to be smart, tell your children to be smart about drinking, but at the same time, it kind of comes at the cost of that idea of victim blaming, right?
True.
Yeah.
If you're only doing the one thing.
Right.
If our culture is also talking to the men out there on not taking advantage of those situations, understanding that that is fine. Someone is allowed to go out and have a good time and drink. And that doesn't mean they're consenting to sexual activity. It doesn't even mean if you're a boyfriend and a girlfriend and you've had sex in the past and you went out and had a drink, that implies it's okay because we've already had sexual intercourse before, or an ex-boyfriend, ex-girlfriend. So if we're not having those conversations on both sides, then it's skewed. And then we're only looking at where did this fall off. But we have those same conversations with people when we say lock your cars at night when you're in a certain place. Make sure that you take care of this whenever you're parking. But if someone has their car stolen, we don't blame them. I mean, if they left their keys in the ignition and did different stuff, you may say, but we still look at the criminal that's behind it. They still may say, well, you can do something different in the past, but the blame still falls on the perpetrator. We are so skewed and imbalanced because we don't have that secondary conversation. And that should be the primary conversation. Both, everybody, women and men, should both be having these conversations with their children, and so that they can continue to move forward and that we change what society really looks like among this.
Right. Mary, any thoughts on all that?
I agree with everything said. I don't know what else I can add.
Okay. So, I mean, how much of is this victim blaming really, and the people that you've dealt with in some of these situations, is that often one of the main concerns is I don't want
Absolutely.
this retribution? Yeah?
Yes, I've had those young women in my office, and they're just horribly ashamed, embarrassed. One of their primary goals is to keep it a secret, and leaving school is one of the first options they consider. There's no question that the victim feeling guilty or harassed or embarrassed is a major motivating factor, certainly in the underreporting that Sammy was describing.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and Sammy, I wrote down some of the numbers that from your reporting. You looked at the Boone County prosecutor saying that there were 81 cases and only 36 of those ended up bringing charges. 20 of those ended with convictions. Can you tell us a little about those numbers and what you found out about how that process usually goes?
Right. I spent a long time talking to a representative of an organization called Equitas, which is a legal organization that helps lawyers prepare cases of violence against women. And one interesting opinion that she had was that prosecutors should actually go forward with these kind of cases, even if they're not at all sure that they're going to win a conviction. And that's a very odd thing for a prosecutor to do. I think you'll find few prosecutors who are willing to do that because, I mean, ethically, they don't want to file charges against a person if they don't think they're guilty, but also they don't want to take a case to court that they don't think they're going to win. On the other hand, in so many of these cases, there actually is a small chance of conviction because of the standard of evidence required, which is you have to prove to a jury beyond a reasonable doubt that this man did rape this woman. And like I've said before, there are often no witnesses. Physical evidence is sometimes hard to come by. The victim's behavior can often seem very odd. to the jury, like she might continue seeing this person or being friends with this person. So that's often a very difficult case to prove in a criminal court. One good thing about the student conduct process, at least in this context, is that Donnell Young, the director of student conduct at the time I was doing the article, he only needs a preponderance of evidence to find an accused student responsible for the offense. So that means he needs to be essentially 51% sure that this person had committed the offense, rather than beyond a reasonable doubt, which is something like 98% sure or something like that. So with the Boone County Prosecutor's Office, the numbers that you cited, they filed charges against a bit more than a third of the cases that they got. And then they did obtain convictions in, I think, 20 of those 36 cases. So that is, I think, a pretty good conviction rate, but it also probably means that there were a lot of cases that were not deemed evidence heavy enough to take all the way to court, or were probably reported to police and then never even made it to the prosecutor's office, because victims and other people report to police, and then if police decide there's a reasonable case, then they take it to the prosecutor's office. So there's kind of a narrowing down process that, is a very valid and very good judicial system, but because of the complications in these cases, is a large part of the problem of why so few rape cases result in actual convictions.
Right. And Mary, maybe give you a moment to respond, as the lawyer at the table, to respond to some of what Sammy just said.
Yes, you talked about an organization urging the filing of criminal charges against alleged rapists. A prosecutor has, like you said, an ethical duty to only file cases in which, and I don't remember the exact words of the standard, but to only file criminal charges in cases where they feel they have the evidence to convict. And so they're not going to file charges to make a public or social statement. They can get disbarred for that. So that's not an option. And we have the problem of victims recanting or victims refusing to testify in domestic violence as well as sexual assault cases. And it really does complicate the prosecutor's job tremendously. In domestic violence, we have evidence-based prosecution, so a lot of prosecutors will go forward without the victim. I don't know whether prosecutors will go forward if the victim of sexual assault is not testifying.
Well, because that's a key piece of evidence, correct? I mean, sometimes there will be physical evidence, but a lot of times that's one of the key pieces, correct?
Right.
Yeah, and so...
Very true. I just wanted to talk about that as well, because I think that's part speaks to the Maryville case. And I think that why it's true that those victim testimonies are important in a prosecutor's view of what needs to move forward with the case. They can move forward with a case without that. It does make it more difficult, but there can be evidence there, especially whenever a victim has already gone through the secondary trauma of going out and having a rape kit done and had that evidence collected. When that evidence comes into play, that really lessens the need for a victim to step forward and go through it over and over and over again. And that is part of the process as well of why people recant, because it becomes so emotionally overwhelming. You just can't do it again. You suffer the trauma again and again and again. So when we have that evidence there, prosecutors, I think, need to be willing to move forward if they feel they can convict even without that victim's testimony. We can also have all the other gambit of things in play that support a victim through that whole process. And so that's where rape crisis centers really come into play, of having a court advocate that can move forward with them and support that victim. But then it also goes back to what we're looking at with family, peers, and the community around you. And are you supporting the victims of rape? Or are you pushing them off into a corner and making them think that you stay there with your shame and don't come forward? And so we really have to see how we, as an entire society, can help people through that process.
I want to take a moment to remind our audience this is Intersection, a program of KBIA and the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Ryan Famuliner, and today we're discussing the challenges in sexual assault cases for the survivors and for the justice system. Joining us in studio are Zach Wilson with the Missouri Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, and Mary Beck, the director of the MU Domestic Violence Clinic and a clinical professor of law. And joining us by Skype is Samantha Sunny. She's a former reporter at the Columbia Missourian, and she recently published a story about how the university and local law enforcement handle sexual assault cases, specifically among the college student population. For you and our audience, what do you think contributes to the phenomenon of victim blaming, which has occurred in some high-profile sexual assault cases? Share your thoughts by giving us a call at 573-882-8925 or email intersection@kbia.org. You could also tweet us at intersectkbia. We also want to remind you this is a live show, so as always, we're not exactly sure what will be said, but considering the specific topic of this week's show, we recommend you decide whether or not the content's appropriate for you, especially if you have children with you. One other thing I wanted to ask Mary and Zach here too about those numbers we threw out there. 80 cases that Boone County prosecutor attempted in 2012. 20 of those resulting in a conviction. Is that a relatively common division of numbers there? What does that usually look like? To see that many of initial cases actually, and then 36 taken, and 20 that actually end up in convictions. How's that ratio compared to what you usually see?
I cannot tell you what those statistics are supposed to be. This School of Journalism previously looked at the number of rape prosecutions in every county in this state and compared it to the population in each county. And I don't remember what the proportions were, but the law school participated with the journalism students in doing that.
Actually, those numbers are a little better than average.
I would think so.
If you're looking across the nation at stats, really 3% of perpetrators of rape and sexual assault serve jail time. 3%. 54% go unreported. So if you're looking at the numbers out of Boone County, if you looked at, we had every victim of sexual assault and rape coming forward because they had that support, you could double those conviction numbers, because over half of the people aren't even reporting and starting the process. And then with the winnowing down that goes through, which is understandable, police are going to have their discretion, prosecutors are going to have their discretion as well too. There's going to be those things that are in our justice system, and that is good. But those are going to actually improve our numbers when we see that. So across the board, we're seeing 3% of perpetrators actually receiving jail time. So if you knew there was a 3% chance of all the trauma you had to do as a victim to step forward and go through a case like this, and there's a 3% chance that you would see justice, that would make it very difficult to step forward. It'd be very difficult to stay with the process. It'd be very difficult to go in and suffer that trauma over and over and over again. So the question is, how can we support those individuals facing those difficult situations, and how can we make sure that perpetrators are more accountable for their behaviors?
So I don't want to, all these incidents we've talked about, Maryville we've talked about multiple times. Is there a silver lining in there that the concept of victim blaming is now kind of a household word, that it's the conversations now happen about that concept? I mean, it seems like in the world of sexual assault victims, that's something that is intrinsic. You're going to understand that if you've been a victim of sexual assault. But I think to the outside world, it's maybe something that obviously we're talking about maybe more foreign. Do you think that these type of high profile incidents, Maryville, Steubenville, do you think that those may actually help this conversation along?
Definitely.
I do.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. If you're looking at socio-ecological change, that starts at the individual. And when an individual learns and sees a situation differently than they did before and understand, I don't want that to occur, then individuals start changing their groups of friends and the people that they associate with. And then that in turns to communities changing, whether that's a campus community, a high school community, a small community like Maryville or Albany or any town out there, and bigger communities like metropolitan areas and states and institutions, and there's systematic change. But all that occurs when the individual decides enough is enough. I'm going to start seeing change out there. And how do I change? What are the things I do to change? Then that influences others to change, and you can start seeing that. These events have caused people to change. There's great work that's happening across the state in individual communities, and there is that information going out there. It's not enough.
Those national groups, what is it called, anonymous.com or something, bringing a lot of pressure to bear on small communities like Steubenville or Maryville, demanding accountability for what actions are taken. I think those groups are very effective as well.
And the truth of it as well, too, even when we specifically talk about Maryville, I don't want people to think that that entire community is horrible. There's good people in Maryville that are appalled by the situation that's going on. And they're starting to speak out and show that support. And that's why actually the girls now are able to step forward, because they felt the support in the community in Albany. And so there's great people in Maryville that support the local program that's up there. There's a great rape crisis center that's up there. But it's as we continue to build forward and everyone supporting each other as we move out, and that's where we can really see this change. And that change is occurring. We just need to continue pushing it forward. And like I said before, you can contact MCADSV. You can go to our website at mocadsv.org and really see the different ways that you can get involved.
When you were earlier on, you threw out a comment about, if everybody reported. Is that ever a reachable goal, or is there we talked about how small the proportions are, but how long does something like that take to even get close to that? And what, again, we're up against a very big problem here.
Right.
We spent
Yes.
50 minutes talking about it, right? But how big of an effort is this going to take? It's not a quick change, right?
No, it's not a quick change. And do I think we ever get to 100% people reporting? No. But right now, the facts on the table are that the reporting is dismal. And that is the community's fault, not the victim's fault. So until we start moving that and really start looking at norms change, then we'll see the numbers change. And that's where the community is responsible to protect the people that are inside the community. You're also responsible to teach the people that are around you as well, too.
And I think that's got to be systemic information education. It's got to start in the middle schools.
Yes.
And it's got to be in college and graduate school as well.
And it
That's
needs to
the
be in
only
businesses, and it needs to be in homes, and it needs to be in churches. It needs to be there. This is part of our society and part of American tradition that we are a sexualized nation that doesn't like to talk about sex. So we need to talk about that. We need to talk to everyone. And I've said it once, and I'll say it again. We need to talk to boys. We need to let them know what is appropriate, what's not, what you can, what you can't do, what is on the continuum of this. How are you exerting power over another individual? It's not acceptable to make a rape joke. It's not acceptable to put someone down. It's not acceptable to judge someone by the way they dress, the way they act. You really need to move forward and look at every kind of message that we're saying and make it systemic.
I actually want to bring in, we have a caller on the line. Murray from Columbia. Murray, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Great. Thank you very much for calling in today.
Oh, you're welcome.
Okay. So,
I'm very interested in this topic.
okay. Well, great. What do you want to share today?
Well, I wanted to share that our family has had a personal experience in this area. My 21-year-old granddaughter, who was a senior in a college on the East Coast, was shot and killed as she came out of a restaurant by her boyfriend with whom she had broken up several weeks before. And the experience has totally, it's been a life-changing experience for our family. My daughter, her mother, is retired now from an administrative job with a college on the East Coast, and she is doing a considerable amount of speaking, most often at the request of prosecuting attorneys, groups, and other government agencies, to various kinds of groups. Like this week, she'll be speaking to a group of young women and their mothers from a lower economic area of the city, and she will be speaking along with a survivor. My daughter felt it was good to have the viewpoint of not only of what horrible thing had happened, but then to have the viewpoint of someone who was able to survive. But my daughter has also worked with the Red Flag campaign, which I'm sure you're aware of, and she is very impressed with what the cities in that area, the Norfolk, Virginia Beach, Chesapeake area, Suffolk, are doing to try to have a lot of educational programs.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing that, Murray. Yeah, and I mean, the idea of that education after the fact, I mean, that probably is where we see a lot of advocates coming from, right? You know?
Yeah, sexual assault is just one behavior in a continuum of domestic violence. And to effectively educate people, the education needs to be directed towards domestic and sexual violence. And it does need to start in middle school. It does need to be continued in high school. It does need to be in college. We also need to recognize that 1/3 of the women killed in this country are killed by their domestic partner or former partner, as in the case of this poor young woman. And we need to start recognizing the seriousness of this and to start conveying it. There are lethality indices now. You can look at the constellation of behaviors of domestic violence and choose several, because those are the ones most linked with ultimate domestic homicide. Rape is one of them, stalking is one of them, use of alcohol is one of them, domestic violence using weapons is one of them. There are about 6 or 7 that are most highly associated with domestic homicide. We need to be teaching that to our college students. They need to know it. They need to know that if they are coerced into sex, if someone hits them with a weapon, if someone hits them when they're drunk, if someone stalks them, those are the behaviors associated with their ultimate demise, with their getting killed.
Wow. Yeah. And so, yeah, it really is the stakes are already high, but this is,
Oh
I
my
mean,
gosh,
it's beyond
yes.
that, right? Yeah.
Yes. 1/3 of women in this country are killed by their domestic partner.
Right.
You know, we talk about girls don't walk near the park, be careful about this or that, but their greatest danger is right in their own home or in their relationships with other romantic partners.
And we mentioned that too, on not talking about those larger domestic assaults, but sexual assaults too. It usually is someone you know, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. And so it's not just someone lurking in the
Right.
bushes or
Yeah,
something
it's
like
not
that.
the stranger in the bushes.
Right.
Right. Yeah. So, and Mary, I guess I know that we actually it took us to a good point, because this is really one of your areas of research too. I mean, what else have you found in working at the domestic violence clinic as well with these women in these situations? I mean, is it tough to make that leap out of those relationships? I mean, it has to be. Yeah.
It is. It's very difficult, partially because a phenomenon called separation assault, when a victim actually leaves a violent relationship, that's the point at which the abuser feels his or her control, domination is most threatened. And they are more likely to actually assault and kill the victim when she or he tries to get out of the relationship. So safety planning is an important feature. And then in terms of permanently making that break, most victims try to leave a violent relationship 6 or 7 times before they finally effectuate a permanent separation. And in order to really make a permanent separation, in my clinic anyway, we have found that action plans are essential. Helping women, particularly women victims, attain economic and emotional independence is critical to actually getting out of a violent relationship.
Okay. Well, that's all the time we actually have for today's intersection. So we'll stop it there for today. But thanks so much to our guest, Zach Wilson with the Missouri Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, Mary Beck, the director of the MU Domestic Violence Clinic and a clinical professor of law, and Samantha Sonny, a former reporter at the Columbia Missourian. And thanks to our caller, Morel from Columbia. We'd like to remind those of you enjoying this as a rebroadcast that Intersection takes place live for a full hour from 2 to 3 every Monday afternoon. You can watch live streaming video of our program each Monday afternoon online at kbia.org. Alongside that video, you can submit your questions and comments and take part in an online discussion with others in the audience. You'll also find an archive of all of our past programs, including the full hour of today's conversation. Intersection is a broadcast from the Reynolds Journalism Institute and is a project of RJI and KBIA. Intersection is produced by Raymond Tungakar, Casey Morrell, Janet Saidi, and Ruben Stern. Travis McMillan's our technical director with production assistance from Caleb Hoke and Andrew Yost. Trevor Harris is our audio producer. I'm Ryan Famulner. Thanks for joining us and have a great week.